Was Midsommar a bad movie? Was it perhaps the worst movie ever produced? When I decided to review Midsommar, I had no idea the rabbit hole that I was heading down. In my small circle of horror movie buffs and artsy college students, Midsommar is a well-received extension to the legacy of Ari Aster. After rewatching the movie, I was overwhelmed by the amount of notes that I had, and I was excited to talk about the religious themes and the unbelievable wealth of symbols that appear throughout this movie. After watching every video that I could find on Midsommar, I was left spinning my wheels, wondering what I could possibly add to this conversation. And in my frustrated discussion with my girlfriend, she mentioned that when this movie came out, there was a significant audience who really didn't like this movie. After procrastinating a bit to sit and read negative reviews about a movie that I loved, I found that she was right. Something like half the reviews on this movie are 1 star, and most of those 1-star reviews suggest that they would rate it lower if they could. There were reviews ranging from simply "this movie is extremely gross" to "this movie was a horrible anti-white, anti-Christian propaganda piece." Certainly, I was surprised to learn that so many people hated this movie with such vitriol, they would consistently call it the worst movie they had ever seen. I thought that I must be missing something. Surely both sides had a valid point. After all, if 50% of any large group of people disagree on something, it would be insanely arrogant to assume that the opposing side is nothing more than stupid and wrong. So I'm not going to do the deep dive into Midsommar that I intended to do when I started this. That's been done to death. Instead, I'm going to do a compliment sandwich style review alternating between my likes and the common dislikes that I read about Midsommar. First up for the likes category, the beginning. Midsommar starts out with an interaction between the main character Danny and her boyfriend Christian. In this scene, we very quickly gather the relationship dynamic between the two.
I've emailed her 3 times and still no response, so I'm getting a little bit nervous.
I'm sure it's fine.
Yeah, probably.
She does this every other day, Danny, and only because you let her.
Well, I don't let her. She's bipolar.
Yeah,
so.
I know, but you do though, babes. You go straight to crisis mode.
Danny, having not heard from her sister since she received an ominous email, is in a panic. And Christian, having gone through similar things with Danny's sister before, is of little help. We also learn that Christian seems to be biding his time to break up with Danny. He's encouraged by his friends to simply get it over. And then, tragedy strikes. Danny's sister has killed herself along with both of Danny's parents, leaving her completely alone with the apathetic boyfriend who's looking for a way out. I like this setup a lot. It moves incredibly quickly, is shot really beautifully, and it really gets us invested into the characters. Well, it really gets us invested into Danny very quickly. It struggles later on to develop the characters further, but I'll talk about that a little bit more down the road. First up for the haters is a gripe about the characters. A consistent refrain among the less than thrilled viewers is that the characters' actions don't make sense. And this complaint is kinda accurate, though I don't know when we started expecting characters in horror movies to have a lot of rhyme or reason to their actions. I think the specific dynamic at play here is that a certain number of people in the audience could not understand why somebody would want to study or live in the cult. Because it takes place so early on and some people don't feel that the cult's an alluring place to live, the ritual suicide feels so out of bounds to them that any possibly sane person would have run from the hills that very moment. And that makes a lot of sense. No rational person sitting in the audience in the movie would stay with the cult. But to me, when you frame it from Danny's perspective, it makes a lot of sense. The cult frames this ritual suicide as a joyful experience for the people partaking.
Instead of getting old and dying in pain and fear and shame, we give our life as a gesture.
A gesture?
Before it can spoil. It does no good dying, lashing back at the inevitable. It corrupts the spirit.
And it makes a lot of sense to me why Danny would be attracted to a culture that openly accepted death and even treated it with joy. They looked at it like they were giving back to the culture. They looked at life as cyclical, and this being the end of a cycle. When someone's facing a loss like that, that kind of theory could be exactly what they need to comfort them. I do concede that it's understandable that a lot of the audience members would struggle to understand what could possibly lead a person to accept the reasoning given by the cult. But Danny is specifically primed to accept the reasoning of the cult. She's completely alone. The only person she has is Christian, her utterly apathetic boyfriend.
I just really need to not be here right now.
Just take some time to yourself, okay?
So Danny reaches out for anyone who will show her any empathy. Next for the likes is the attention to detail. Midsommar is a story that's told in its details. And it's clear to me that extreme care was taken when putting together this film to expand subtly on the story. Whether it be through the consistent haze following Danny around during the early part of the film, or through the appearances of the bear symbolism throughout, the early painting that basically predicts the entire film, or Danny's sister's face appearing in the trees. This story is full of Easter eggs for eagle-eyed viewers. It also uses these small moments to progress Danny's character development. Danny is lured closer and closer into the cult as they show a warm embrace opposed to Christian's cold, distant behavior and total lack of empathy. For the first time, we see Danny, who's been surrounded with nobody but her shitty boyfriend and his apathetic friends, come face to face with possibly the most empathetic people that she could find. The next common dislike I saw was that the movie is slow. After the death of Danny's family, she finds out that Christian has been planning a trip to Sweden and lying to her about it. In order to avoid a fight, Christian invites Danny along, and from then on, the movie is kind of slow. Most of what we're watching is expository dialogue and mushroom trips. The tension is built in the emotional response of the characters, specifically Danny, as she continually raises red flags throughout the film. She repeatedly raises her concerns with Christian, who virtually ignores her, leaving the cult members to empathize with and comfort Danny. All of this functions to slowly turn Danny closer and closer to the grips of the cult, but this is a slow process, and if you don't find yourself sufficiently engaged by the emotional reactions of Danny, along with the beautiful visuals, the middle hour and a half of this movie could be extremely rough. My next like is the reversal of norms in this movie. From the posters alone, it's obvious that Midsommar is no normal horror flick. Rather than taking place under the cover of darkness, allowing the audience's imagination to build most of the tension, Midsommar is under broad daylight. In fact, it's set to feel like a joyous occasion. Midsommar, after all, is a celebration in Pellé's commune, and the people there are warm and inviting. They dance and they welcome their guests with open arms.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Hey.
Hello? Hello? Welcome.
Hi.
Welcome.
Hi.
Welcome home.
Oh,
Oh, we are so very happy to have you. Yeah.
thank you.
This works to lull you into a false sense of security that is interrupted by the violent deaths that follow. The film plays with flipping what a normal response would be a lot. The cult feels like an empathetic mother figure rather than an angry group of ritualistic murderers. The primary protagonist of the film is really only antagonized by her boyfriend, and really only on the level that he just isn't a very good boyfriend. Rather than run away from an obvious threat, Danny takes shelter in the arms of a smothering mother that offers her salvation at the cost of her individuality. To my eye, this is extremely clever, though it does make the film less traditionally scary, and it's definitely not a thriller film. Really, I question if I'd even classify this movie as a horror movie. Regardless, I think that making the villain something that is extremely attractive is something that more horror movies should play with. The next criticism is that it's gross, and this is the criticism that I have the least patience for. Even if it is true, and it definitely is, I really don't feel like this is good enough reasoning to give the movie a bad review. Not liking something that's gross is perfectly fine, and it not being for you is perfectly fine. But consistently I saw people who were genuinely upset by the fact that anybody could enjoy a movie that was this gross. And I don't think that's very valid. I think you should let people enjoy the things they enjoy. Also, old people being naked isn't a reason to think it's gross. I get that the sex scene was long, but it's just naked people. Get over yourself if that really disturbed you. My last like is the symbols, and Midsommar is packed with symbols. And of course, it has the advantage of being a play on religious ideas, so it draws a lot of symbols from that, but they put it to good use in Midsommar. And I'm going to take a sidebar here to go through some of my favorite symbols in this movie. Starting with color. Yellow and blue are the significant symbolic colors in this movie. Symbolically, yellow is typically representative of joy and happiness, but in Midsommar, it's in large part used to symbolize death. Danny's parents are on a yellow bedspread when they're killed. In the house of her family, we follow a yellow hose to the upstairs that's been carrying the smoke there. And of course, the pyramid of sacrifice is also yellow. And of course, the sacrificial pyramid is also yellow. I kind of like the pyramid of sacrifice. I might keep that. Blue, often used to represent depression, cold, and isolation, is used in Midsommar to represent acceptance, calm, and family. In the film, most open doors are painted blue. Blue is adorned by the cultists in their embroidery, and the the elders ready for sacrifice wear blue. The use of color adds another layer to make the visuals in Midsommar even more intriguing. The maypole is the centerpiece of the Harga compound, and is actually a real Nordic tradition. Traditionally, it represents fertility and new life, and depending on your view of Midsommar, it could represent the same thing here. Of course, it could also represent death, being the stake through the heart of those who find themselves near it. Or it could be the cross that you die on. This all depends on whether you see Dani as having beaten her trauma and settled in with a new family, or as a woman who lost her mind and ordered a cult to murder her boyfriend. On to sacrifice. I think this is where a lot of people check out of this film. Human sacrifice is a tough idea to swallow, and the thought that any modern culture could see it as morally acceptable is disturbing. But the idea of sacrifice, and more specifically of human sacrifice, plays a really interesting role in the film. After the first two elders willingly jump from a cliff to end their lives, it is considered to be a great joy. These people have accepted their death and are contributing to the culture by sacrificing their own lives in service of the collective. And it's pretty easy to see how this idea could be of some comfort to Dani as she mourns the loss of her own family. Perhaps their sacrifice could after all be worth something. The idea of sacrifice is one that triumphs over human nature. We learned as a primitive species, barely smarter than apes, that you could sacrifice something now for something greater in the future. And before we understood this idea, we acted it out. Human beings first sacrificed the most valuable thing that they could, their children. And then they evolved on to livestock and other food, all the way up to now when we sacrifice going to McDonald's for a little bit of extra money in our savings account. We think of ourselves as more evolved than someone who could actually think to sacrifice a human as a way of ensuring future prosperity. But the truth is, we're just lucky enough to have the information as to what sacrifices bring prosperity more specifically. And we have this information because people prior to us acted out the information they didn't understand. Next, I want to talk about fire. Fire is used in the final sacrifice when Dani chooses to have Christian burned. In this, fire is the destroyer, killing Christian and severing Dani's remaining ties to the outside world. She surrenders to the embrace of the cult, fire symbolizing the loss of herself. From another point of view, fire is a purifying agent to Dani. The toxic relationship in which she was ignored is gone. The part of Dani that relied on Christian is burned away, leaving her free. Again, this depends on your take on why Dani has this final smile. And finally, the bear. In ancient Scandinavia, Vikings were said to go berserk. In battle, bears were highly regarded for their single-minded ferocity, and the ancient Nordics also revered honesty and loyalty in their warriors. This is another reversal of norms. Christian is none of these things. He fails to fight for Dani throughout the film, especially early when Dani's sister is missing and we don't yet know her family's fate. A better partner in that situation may have been fiercely determined to find out what was happening, maybe even in time to save the life of Dani's parents. But no, Christian is a disloyal, apathetic liar. He's sewn into the bear suit and burned alive because he represents the worst qualities in people, and the cult is trying to rid themselves of that. And lastly, in the complaints department, I want to talk one more time about the characters, and this time about their lack of character development. I think this is probably the most legitimate complaint about this movie, and because no character other than Dani has any real arc. In fact, any character who is affected in the least by the actions of the Harga is pretty much instantly killed off. Dani does have a journey that ends with her being sucked into the grips of a cult, but the change in her character is subtle. I can see how you might think that the Dani at the end of the film and the Dani here are one and the same. However, I will say I haven't managed to come up with a character arc that doesn't drastically alter the progression of the film in some way that takes away from its point. Before I give this movie a score, there is one more thing that I wanted to talk about, and that is this idea that Christian didn't actually cheat on Dani. I saw this in a lot of negative reviews, and I just wanted to address it real quick, because Christian definitely cheated on Dani. Even though he was drugged, Christian took the drugs, knowing full well there was a woman actively pursuing him on the compound. Christian knew what the consequences of taking the drugs were. You could see it on his face when he was pulled away. Christian absolutely cheated on Dani with intent. Now, there is one more dislike I want to address, but I'm going to save that till the end. First, I'm going to give this movie a score. Starting with the plot, I found it very engaging. I thought that the scenes with some action were were well paced throughout the movie to keep it flowing well, and I was invested with Danny's journey throughout the rest of the film when it was slower. I'm gonna give the plot a 7 out of 10. I can't go any higher because I know that in some places it is really slow moving. The writing in this movie is also really good. I didn't see any serious complaints about the dialogue, even in the particularly negative reviews, and I don't have any either. I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10, just because I don't think it was groundbreakingly written. The cinematography is where Midsommar really shines. It uses a combination of beautiful set design and creative camera work to make one of the most visually stunning horror movies that exists. It gets a 10 out of 10. As I already discussed, I think that the characters are kind of a weak point of Midsommar. This movie has a really interesting villain in the Harga, but all of the characters in the Harga are kind of one and the same, and the cult's whole purpose is to function as one entity. And that single entity doesn't go through any significant change either. Danny's character is really the only developed character in this movie, and I do think she's well done, even if some of her character development may feel insignificant to some. But I still don't think that I can give the characters any better than a 5 out of 10 without another solidly arced character. Thematically, I think Midsommar does really well. It draws on the familial relationship and the empathy that Danny is in a desperate search for to make an interesting point. The empathy provided by the Harga does not come free. To obtain it, you can no longer maintain an individual identity. While letting go of this appears to Danny as a triumph, it's not clear that Danny won. She managed to escape her unsatisfying and bordering on abusive relationship, but she traded that for a relationship that doesn't see enough value in you after 72 to keep you around. I think that the theme of this movie is very interesting, and it gets a 9 out of 10. Overall, I think Midsommar deserves the 8 out of 10 I'm gonna give it. But I do kind of understand why it takes so much heat. It's a weird movie. It's actually kind of exceptionally weird. And whenever something goes kind of far outside the norm, it's gonna take some heat. Some people just aren't gonna like it. I also think that there is some failure on the part of Midsommar to draw the audience members into the cult. I think the point of the movie was to make you understand why Danny was so allured by the cult, and I think that it failed a lot of people in that regard. And this brings me to my least favorite criticism of Midsommar, and it's the one criticism that I will genuinely take away from the negative commenters, and that is that there was no point. As far as I'm concerned, this could not be further from the truth. The point was the cult was ambiguous enough to lure Danny in, and like I said earlier, the fact that this is misunderstood by so many people is a failure on the movie. You're supposed to leave the theater conflicted as to whether Danny has triumphed over her trauma or slowly gone insane and succumbed to the allure of crazy murderers. Because of so many people missing this point entirely, I can't help but feel that the cult just failed to connect with some of the audience. And that led to Midsommar being perceived as a bad attempt at a failed brand of horror. And I really don't think it's that. I think Midsommar does deserve the praise that it gets by a lot of reviewers. I still love this movie. But if you don't, that's okay. You're allowed to not like things that other people like. Just try not to shit on them for liking it. Let me know what you did think about Midsommar in the comments. Again, just try to be tactful, and hit like and subscribe, and check out my latest video on the Bob Dylan story, A Complete Unknown. And nobody would really know his face or name. But obviously, since I'm here talking about this today, Dylan was more than that.